Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Ybele and Organic Denmark, for inviting me to give this keynote speech. And I feel that as a special responsibility, because I think I need to reflect on what has been going on for these 2 days and what you've said and the conclusions that you've reached, and at the same time try to add some new perspectives from the EEA's point of view. First of all, I'd like to highlight that I was asked to present this. Will a shift to sustainable farm systems pay off to society? And please note the little addition economic outlook. That poses me with some problems. Of course, if you're invited, you would like to do what the organizers ask you, so I'll stick to this title. But I'd like to point at this. I mean, if you ask me, will this pay off to society, then, well, somebody here from Denmark, who's far more intelligent than I ever will be, said prediction is very difficult, and especially of the future. So if you ask me, will this pay off to society, I'm not sure if I could give the answer. And to prove the point, and of course Niels Bohr was right, but to prove the point, we've got another quote here. It says, "No woman in my time will be prime minister," which was said by Margaret Thatcher. So people who know a lot more about the topics they talk about than I do can get it awfully wrong. And so I'll have to be a bit modest here. But more importantly, I'm not an economist. So I work for the European Environment Agency, so we've got an environmental remit and not an economic one. So if you expect me to come with the figures on what a shift to sustainable agriculture would mean in economic terms, I think I'll have to disappoint you. I'll look into economic things, but I cannot present you with any deep economic analysis. So this leads me to slightly redo this title, and I crossed out the economic bit. I will talk about economics, but I'll not focus on it. And I would also like to say that, well, it's not only because I'm not an economist. I don't know if you've noticed, but here in Copenhagen or in Denmark in general, people love to jog and to exercise. And they do that because because they're concerned about their physical condition and about their well-being. I have yet to meet the first person who said that he or she thought that he could make money out of it. So if you think of the well-being of the planet and the well-being of our society, I think there is an overrepresentation of an economic argument. Everybody thinks we should put things into economic terms, but I'm doubtful about that. I think it's useful, but only up to a certain point. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to run you through a quick presentation of what I see as the context in which this discussion is taking place, and I'd like to paint the wider picture. First of all, let me say that for me, agriculture, and actually I realized that took entirely the wrong picture of the road here. There's a road here behind my house. I love the picture, so I put it in, but actually it's about people. And I think that whenever we talk about CAP or the prospects for agriculture, we talk about people. And we're not talking about just a sector. We're talking about a sector that provides us with a key and essential commodity, which is food. And the people who do that need to see a future in it and need to be willing to pursue this. We also should not forget that agriculture, and particularly a couple of centuries ago, meant in many cases poverty. I think we need to have that in mind if we think of the environment and if we think of sustainable agriculture. First and foremost, it's for me about people. I quickly want to say something about the concepts that we're developing within the Environment Agency to tackle these kind of issues. And first of all, we work within what we call a perspective of a green economy. And it's not that new, really, because we've had the sustainable development initiatives. But the way we look at it now in the agency is that we look at these three circles: an ecosystem perspective, an economy perspective, and a human well-being perspective. And when we talk in the agency about greening the economy, we talk primarily about the upper two circles. And what we try to achieve is reconciling economic growth with ecosystem resilience. And this is not trivial, because the ecosystem, the resource efficiency agenda that we see can all too easily be transferred into an economic agenda. There is, of course, an economic incentive to become more efficient with your resources. But what we try to point out is that there are also ecosystem resilience issues that kind of set the boundary conditions for society. And if you compare that to the climate change debate, the 2 degrees guardrail in climate change is very important. I mean, you could argue whether that 2 degrees guardrail is sufficiently underpinned, But what it does, it says if we go beyond these 2 degrees, there will be irreversible problems that we can't handle. So the 2 degrees guardrail is the basis for a discussion how efficient we should be with our resources. And I think that's true for many other issues in society. If we think about agriculture, we should think about what is that ecosystem resilience that we try to achieve, and in what way does it set boundary conditions for our economic activities. A point that I saw was flagged by many of you in the past few days is that we shouldn't look at agriculture as such. And if you talk about the CAP, it's a policy that deals with agriculture. But if you look at the whole issue of greening the CAP, then you have to realize that it sits in a wider perspective. First of all, a food system perspective. Lots of things have been said here about the consumer perspective, which is equally important as the productive perspective. We shouldn't only look at food production, we should also look at access to the food, and we should look at the quality requirements that we have. That food system perspective is, I think, very important. And you can't blame the CAP for it, because the CAP wasn't designed to tackle a food system. It's now used to tackle certain issues in the food system, like food security, but it's by design not sufficient. Well, I said a little bit about the green economy, so we think that that food system concept sits in the green economy concept, and as a European Environment Agency, we also look at the environmental acquis, our environmental legislation, and what that implies. Finally, and then I'll stop with these graphs because they can be a bit difficult, but this is a graph that we use to make clear that ultimately, and here I come back to the point that ultimately it's about people. Well, in the agency, we put human well-being and health in the center. I think that the most basic argument for environmental policy is that ultimately people are concerned about human well-being and health. And the interesting thing is that in order to secure our well-being, we exploit resources. And we've identified 4 main categories of resources. Of course, it's food, it's water, it's energy, and it's materials. And interestingly, exploiting the one has consequences for the other. If we produce food, we need water and we need energy. If we produce food with the use of external chemicals, with pesticides, we may affect water bodies and we may ultimately affect water quality. So all these resources and the way we use them are heavily interlinked. And the feedbacks to human well-being are, well, first of all, there are direct relationships, because we need these resources for our well-being, but there are also indirect ones through the environment. And they can manifest themselves at 2 scales. They can be local, or they can be at a European scale, but it can also be global feedbacks. And one of the global feedbacks that I've already mentioned is the climate change one, where, of course, our use of energy leads to a global feedback and ultimately to human health and well-being issues. So this is the kind of overarching concept that we use to map the different interdependencies of the way we use our resources. And I'd like to point out, and this is, I think, a main point that I would like to get across. If we're talking about greening agriculture, I think what we have to do is to define in what sense we think we should green it. What is green? What is an environmentally sustainable agriculture about? And I think you have to look at the key issues that agriculture affects. First of all, the nutrient cycle. If we produce food, if we have agriculture, then we affect the nutrient cycle of this planet. And the most important ones, of course, are nitrogen and phosphorus. Secondly, the carbon cycle. We change vegetation cover, we change carbon content in the soils, and we emit greenhouse gases. Thirdly, the water cycle. We do that through drainage and irrigation. And finally, through chemicals. Within agriculture, we use chemicals, and we produce chemicals from other sources and release them into the environment. And composite effects of those key elements are biodiversity value and landscape cultural value. Those are kind of composite issues that are of concern. But the 4 ones that are listed on top are the main ones. And what I lack at the moment is a coherent perspective on how we think we could improve agriculture's performance for those 4 elements. I'll come back to that later. I told you I'd like to focus on the context in which we do this, because if you look at the CAP, I already said CAP tries to address a number of food system issues without being designed for it. We should also realize that the CAP operates at a European scale, and many of the issues that we deal with are heavily influenced by global megatrends. And I'll show you a couple of these. These are derived from our State of Environment 2010 report. First of all, and this will not come as a surprise to any of you, it's population development. And referring back to my first slide, even though the demographics is an area where we have fairly solid statistics and can fairly solidly calculate what will happen, there is a fair amount of uncertainty in that data set. So we don't really know what the population will be like in 2050 or 2100. But at the moment, we assume that it will be around 9 billion people. Well, going from 6 to 9 billion people will increase the total pressures on the cycles that I mentioned before, the nutrient cycle, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the chemicals, enormously. If we look at what these demographics mean for society, then here we've got the aging graphs, the projected aging of societies throughout the world. We see an increased population growth, but it's flattening out. So the growth rates will get lower and lower, which means that all parts of the globe will face an aging trend. Some regions more than others. And this, and I'll come to that later, at the European level, it's extremely important when it comes to the perspectives for an agricultural intervention. I'll come to that. I think it's probably more important than anything else. Then a globalization trend. If you talk about mega trends all over the globe, the current trends are that people concentrate themselves more and more into cities. It's because that's where the work is, that's where the people see their perspectives, and that's also where people are drawn to because of lifestyles. This is a megatrend that we shouldn't forget. And yesterday I noted a concern about young people wanting to become a farmer. Well, it's not about a common agricultural policy, it's about the attractiveness of the work to be done that draws people to this profession. Urbanization, lifestyle trends are very, very important. They manifest themselves at the global scale, but also in Europe. Very importantly, of course, the consumption outlooks. And the big change that we will see, or that is projected to happen over the next coming decades, is that there will be more and more people that qualify as a middle-class income with the consumption pattern that goes with it. And with that goes a shift, as we've seen in the past, very often, a shift to more meat in the diet and more consumer products consumption. So all of that is going to happen, and we will see a massive increase in middle-class consumption with all the pressures on the environment that go with it. Energy demands, this will not be very new, but I'll draw your attention not only to the increasing energy demand, but also to the increasing biomass demand. The biomass will have to be derived from the same ecosystems that we use for producing our food. So it adds a lot of pressure to this already amazingly increasing pressure on our farm landscape. And that pressure, I show you here a map that to the left you see what is called the HAMP, the Human Appropriated Prime Production. So what it shows is how much of Earth's plant growth is being directly converted or used by humans. And it's already massive. That doesn't come as a surprise. All the landscapes in the moderate climate belt are heavily influenced by human beings. And the perspective of increasing our impacts on natural plant growth are actually not that big. And if you look to the right, what will happen with the projected area of domesticated or farmland area that is needed, you'll see an increase. So already we have exploited a large part of the planet that can be exploited, and it will still go up. And that doesn't go without any problems. So although we know that we need to produce more, we also know that the pressures that are being exerted at global level lead to big problems. It's not given that productivity will rise. In many areas, we actually see increasing water problems. And here we see the risk of soil erosion by water as projected to, what was it, 2050, I believe. The way we exploit these natural habitats leads to an impact on the water cycle. I've talked about the nutrient cycle, I'm now talking about the water cycle. So although we know that we need to get more out of the existing land, there are actually big risks that we not be able to do that. So that looks all pretty dark. I talked about the water cycle, I talked about the carbon cycle. Now I'd like to say something about the nutrient cycle. Because one of the key elements of agriculture, modern agriculture, is that we boost production by relying on external inputs, chemicals. And particularly the industrially produced fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers should be mentioned here. Because it's not, we were all used to it, that we can use these industrially produced fertilizers, but actually this invention was done not so very long ago. Before that, all nitrogen that could be used by plants had to be fixed through natural processes. And we've got lots of nitrogen, but it can't be used. We've got lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but it's inert, in N2 gas. And the natural processes of converting that into a nitrogen form that plants actually can uptake is limited. We've augmented that with an industrial process, the Haber-Bosch process. And this is, again, not trivial, because what we do by using that, we produce ammonia out of nitrogen gas. And the additional amounts of reactive nitrogen are massive, and we have boosted our production with it, but that comes at a cost. And I'll come to the problems of that later, of excess nitrogen being applied. And finally, I would like to show this, which I think is quite interesting. I've heard the word innovation a lot yesterday. And there are two things on innovation that I'd like to mention. First of all, the innovation driven by the market leads, if you look at what happens, more and more to technological fixes rather than the ecological innovations that this audience would probably like. That's one thing. So the market pressures drive, if you look back, drive technological innovation much faster than eco-ecological innovation. That's one thing. And the other thing is that given the changed power balance in the world, the innovations and the inventions are not coming from Europe. Huh? So these things are new things are being invented all over the planet, and by the way we spread our technology and by the way we spread information, they will be applied across the globe. So although we think that we can have a policy that addresses innovation, we should be keenly aware that many of the innovations that we may face in the future will come from a very different background and with very different rationales behind it. I'll quickly run you through the situation in Europe then. It has been mentioned already that agriculture in Europe is very, very diverse. I give you two examples of a small-scale system to the left in Eastern Europe and the very rational, high-input farming system in the Netherlands to the right. And we've used this graph to kind of capture what's actually going on. On the x-axis, you see an increasing intensity in terms of inputs and in terms of yield. And on the y-axis, you see associated biodiversity of the farmed landscape. And the high nature value farmland that Nat was talking about yesterday sits in the left part of this graph with high associated biodiversity. Many of the habitats that we've listed under the Habitats Directive in the EU are actually farmed. So this graph also shows, it's a sort of formal representation of what we think is important. Because if we stop farming those habitats, we will lose them. And that's why in the far end of this graph, we say that biodiversity will go down. At a different scale, you might come to a different conclusion, I should add. Well, we try to map, on the basis of the data we had, where we see these farming systems in Europe that are still associated with high biodiversity. And this is an analysis that we did. The green parts on this map are the high nature value farmland areas as we can detect them. And you see that they are very much concentrated in the peripheral regions of Europe and not in the key agricultural production areas in the western and central parts. And here I come to the point of demographics, because and I know that Nat said we should look upon these high nature value farming systems as systems of the future with an appeal. I think that the reality forces me to say that they are, in many cases, the systems of the past. And if you look at the demographics, and to the left I plotted the age distribution in Europe, where the red areas are predominantly elderly, or where the population, where the proportion of elderly in the population is very high, and to the right, it's in the farming community. To the left, you can already see that there are huge regions that we characterize as high nature value farmland regions in Italy, in Spain, are actually facing a population that's aging, or that's relatively old. And the farming population is even older. The farming population is even older. People concentrate in the cities. So I think that in many of these regions, what we think is high nature value farmland, we cannot solve that with money. We can't say, well, okay, the CAP should give these people more money. Well, at best, it would be a very temporary solution. And these big driving forces behind the changing landscape cannot be sorted by a common agricultural policy. And here is the graph, what happens at the moment, what the current reproduction figures are for Europe. And you'll see that this shows how many children an average female in the European population, average woman in the female population gets. And you can see that for all countries in the EU, with the exception, and well, Turkey is not in the EU, but Turkey is the only exception where the reproduction rate would be sufficient to maintain the population. And in Italy, it's even that bad that in one generation's time, the population would effectively halve. Again, a common agricultural policy cannot solve this. If we face depopulation, if we face depopulation of rural countryside, you cannot solve that with a CAP intervention. Then on organic farming. If you look at the share of organic farming in Europe, then it's still very low. There has been a pretty steep increase over the last decade, but still it is only a fragment of the total market. And the highest shares are about 12%, but typically it's around on average, it's about 4% of farmland that is farmed organically. This would be low input systems with a lot of environmental added value, but we see that it's still only a very limited proportion of our farmland. And here we see an issue that I mentioned before, these nitrogenous inputs, these fertilizer inputs. Here you see the surpluses, the nitrogen surpluses that we find across Europe. And the country that I come from, the Netherlands, is on the far left, and it has got by far the worst nitrogen balance. But on average, you can see there is actually a surplus of nitrogen, and that surplus, of course, goes into the environment. And what you see there, well, this is a picture that we have on nitrogen concentrations in rivers. We've got better data, more recent data for the Water Framework Directive, but I couldn't show them yet. But you see that the concentrations are highest in rivers, that is, as the basis, as the result of this nitrogen input. And yesterday I also noted that there was a mention of problems in the Baltic Sea and the Polish agriculture affecting that. Well, here you can see on the red spots, the yellow and the red spots, where we actually have eutrophication problems in coastal areas. So all that nitrogen, and again, it's nitrogen that is produced, most of that nitrogen is produced in excess of what natural ecosystems produce, ends up in the environment and creates problems. So that looks all pretty bleak. And if I look at what the big challenges for Europe are, and I try to capture that in this picture, you see very different challenges across Europe. In the central parts of Europe, we've got this big issue of nitrogen surpluses and chemical inputs and almost vanished biodiversity at field level. And in the peripheral regions, the green regions, we have an opposite problem. We have a problem of losing extensive farmland systems with high associated biodiversity. And then in the south, we also have increasing water problems. And again, we should see this in the context of climate change, where the water problems that this region is facing will probably aggravate. So these, as we see it, are the big problems environmentally that we should tackle. And then I come to the CAP. What do we do with the CAP? How can the CAP help solve these problems? Well, first of all, the original goals of the CAP were quite straightforward. We would like to secure food prices, or the availability of food that people can afford, and we would like to stabilize the markets. Secure availability of supplies, and to provide consumers with food at reasonable prices. That was pretty straightforward. And we've had a number of reforms that subsequently changed bits, because of course this was associated with also some problems, in particular of overproduction and environmental nature. And the CAP has, through subsequent reforms, got a greener and greener profile. But we looked at where the money goes. We thought, well, now that we know where these high nature value farmland areas are, where farming is associated with high nature value, how much support do they get? So we looked at the distribution of CAP spending across Europe, and this is the picture for the first pillar, where you see that all the money goes into the areas where we have big environmental problems in terms of nutrient surpluses. And all the areas where there is a lot of high nature value associated with farmland get very, very little money. And that's even true for, well, to a lesser extent, but for the expenditure, which only a little bit, it's only a few % of the total expenditure, that explicitly went into agri-environment measures under the CAP. And there we see a very, very uneven picture, where, for example, in Austria, a lot of money is spent on agri-environment schemes. But, for example, in Spain, with lots of high nature value farmland, we see very, very little expenditure. So our conclusion a couple of years ago was, with the current CAP intervention, we are not going to do much of significance for these high nature value farmland areas. Although it was in the policy objectives, and although it was acknowledged, we said this is not really going to help. And now we've got new reform. So now we get new elements coming in, and everybody knows this, of course. It's now about food security, environment and climate change, and territorial balance. And I don't want to go into the details of these CAP reform measures. You know them all. But I think there is a genuine attempt to green the current intervention and to go in the right direction. The green payment under the first pillar is, I think, a really good attempt to at least finance some environmental performance under the first pillar. The agri-environment schemes are still there to supplement this with specific measures. There will be enhanced cross-compliance. There will be a territorial redistribution of funds. So we looked at this very uneven funding, where we said, well, farming systems with high associated nature value get very little money. That will be tackled to some extent. What that money does, of course, on the ground is still to be seen, because it might be that this funding, rescheduling of funds, may even make these farming systems disappear more quickly. So we don't even know whether it's going to be good, but at least we can see that there is a genuine attempt to do something about it. So all in all, my conclusion about this is that I think it's a firm step in the right direction. And if you look at the political climate, it's actually quite a brave step. So I think that many of the issues that are currently being proposed under the CAP will run the risk of being watered down rather than enforced. So I'd like to highlight that. There is definitely a greening element in it, and I hope that that will survive. But having said that, I also think it's a very small step. I think that in order to effectively tackle the environmental issues, we would have to do much more rigorous things. And I doubt very much whether that could be done in a horizon up to 2020. I think it's a long-term perspective that we should address. But I think we need a long-term transition towards efficient yet low-input agri-systems. I think we can't escape the fact that productivity, certainly globally, should go up, but without relying on external inputs. And actually, in Europe and in North America, it would be very wise to revert the trend and to reduce our reliance on external inputs. And that's where organic farming, of course, also comes into the picture. I think we need to do that. We need to create high efficient yet low input systems, which will require innovation and new knowledge. On the issue of high nature value farmland, I think, and Ned would probably agree, that the perspectives of those farming systems are very different across Europe. I think that in many areas that we currently see, the perspectives are actually pretty low. But in some regions where the socio-economic fabric is right, you might be able to make a difference. And an example that comes to mind, the uplands of the UK, for example, I could imagine that intensification isn't an option there. People can actually engage in farming as an additional income. They've got other sources of income as well. So the whole socio-economic fabric and the ecological constraints are there to make this a viable long-term option. But I think in order to make it survive, we would need much stronger support to these systems. So I would argue for a much stronger and much more regionally specific effort to try and maintain some of these high nature value farmland systems in areas of Europe that we think have the potential. And most importantly, what I think is still lacking in the CAP is a coherent perspective on resource efficiency in agriculture. Again, with these three main cycles in mind, the carbon cycle, the nutrient cycle, and the water cycle. I don't see that in the current proposals, and I think we need to go towards that. When it comes to going all the way for a long-term transition, I think we would need to establish some environmental intervention principles. And as I already said, I think first and foremost we should try at the global level at least to reduce the footprint. We should do everything we can to prevent that there will be even more farmland than we have currently today at the expense of natural habitats. I think that's one of the key issues. At the same time, I think we should reduce the dependency on external chemical inputs, and that's a pressure, because the one objective is not necessarily logically consistent with the second. And we should also increase water and energy efficiency in agriculture. But having said all that, I think we cannot be, yeah, I'll stop. I think we cannot do all that without tackling consumption, and this has been said before. I think if we want to make this transition towards greener agriculture, we will also be forced to rethink our consumption patterns and to reduce the wastes and to tackle this. And as I said before, I only see a possibility for dedicated HNV farmland support in selected regions. Okay, that brings me to the end because I'm asked to stop. This I don't know if you know the pipe thing, but this is a little variation on it. Ceci n'est pas une casquette verte. This is not a green cap. And I'd like to point out at the ambiguity of this whole thing, because I don't want to make fun of the current proposals. I think they're good. And I think they are a step towards greening the cap. I just think they don't go far enough. And finally, and we've been talking about data, and we've talked about knowledge, and we've been talking about economics. I would also say that imagination is more important than knowledge. I think we need a vision, and we need to convey that vision, and we need to make people enthusiastic about an idea. And that may be more important than anything else. And that's where I would like to stop. Thank you.